Hi, this is Kelsey Wachowski, and in this video we are going to be reviewing Units 1, 2, and 3 as sort of a midterm review. This review is not meant to be exhaustive or in-depth. It will be cursory in nature, but should you wish to find more in-depth videos, please search my YouTube channel on the given topic, and you will surely find it. So let's start off with none other than Unit 1. And of course, Unit 1 dealing with three democratic theories. There's the idea that interest groups are competing with one another. Neither group of interest groups are dominating. They are competing equally, and everything's kumbaya. However, in a hyperpluralistic idea is where you have too many interest groups that are competing that nothing gets done, and this leads to policy gridlock. And then you have the elite theory, the idea that the rich and the very powerful are the ones that are governing this democracy. And if you subscribe to the idea of the 1%, this would be something that you might believe in terms of the theory of democratic governments. Now, in terms of the United States is not a true democracy, because if you had a true democracy, you would not have representatives. You would be actually voting on every single piece of legislation. However, what we have is a democratic republic. That is where we elect leaders to represent our political views, and we see that in Congress, our president. We also see that at the state as well as local level. So we are a democratic republic. Now, in terms of American political culture, overarching ideas here, the idea of liberty, meaning freedom, egalitarianism, and that is really referring more to equal opportunity, not economic equality. And this is where the United States differs with other modern democracies, particularly in Europe. The idea of individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, laissez-faire policies such as capitalism, and populism, give the people what they want. Now, our Constitution dates back, of course, prior to the American Revolutionary War, which is sort of the ground roots behind it, and the Enlightenment. In terms of John Locke, we see Montesquieu, but Locke in particular with his ideas of natural rights, and we see that certainly in the Declaration of Independence, and we'll see his ideas also translated into our first Constitution, which is the Articles of Confederation. But there are so many weaknesses. Too much power is given to the states. You basically have a non-existent national government. It can't coin currency. It has no national court. It has no national president. It cannot tax. And ultimately, we see Shays' Rebellion being the tipping point where the national government cannot even put down a rebellion because it really has no national army. So this is going to lead to the Constitutional Convention, in which we're going to devise our second Constitution, which is still in place today. And if you recall, we have a lot of issues dealing with equality. So with respect to representation, the New Jersey plan looked to have equal representation by state regardless of population, sort of like what we have today with the Senate. Every state gets two. The Virginia plan, which was much more populated or favored populated states, had representation based on the amount of population in each state. And that today comprises of our House of Representatives. So we merge these two plans together. We get the Connecticut or Great Compromise, and that's going to come about. We also have the compromise of the 3/5, which is going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And with respect to voting in terms of political equality, that was left to the states to decide in terms of voting requirements. But one thing that's embedded into our Constitution is something known as the Madisonian Model. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is going to advocate that these four components be inputted into our Constitution. For example, limiting majority control, separating our powers, creating checks and balances, and establishing a federal system between the national government and the states. And ultimately, this is designed to prevent tyranny, as we can see here with these various components. Now, in terms of ratification of our Constitution, many smaller states, such as Rhode Island, were very hesitant to sign on, and that's why states like Rhode Island even boycott the Constitutional Convention. It is not until the addition of the Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments to the Constitution, these are guarantees of individual and state rights. So if you remember things like such as the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the Eighth Amendment, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, these are guarantees that the states as well as individuals have rights. So again, you're going to see that the fear of the central government controlling the states and the individuals, the population too much is going to be relatively mitigated here. And this is ultimately which is going to usher in ratification, meaning they are going to adopt this new Constitution. Now, our Constitution espouses this very important idea known as federalism. You're sharing power between the states and the federal government. The federal government does not get all the power. The states get to make some choices as per our 10th Amendment. That is, of course, called reserved powers. But it's important to note that since the founding of our Constitution, the power of the national government has increased over time, and starting with a variety of different Supreme Court cases. Marbury v. Madison, starting with judicial review. McCulloch v. Maryland, with respect to the Supremacy Clause and the Alaska Clause. And then, of course, Gibbons v. Ogden, which is going to utilize the Commerce Clause. Ultimately, in the 1800s, you're going to see the erosion of state power at this point, and you're going to see the national government increase its power. But again, states do have powers under the 10th Amendment, and they also have obligations to other states, including the full faith and credit. So if you get married in one state, your marriage license has to be recognized in another state. Also, with privileges and immunities, a state cannot discriminate against a person from another state just because they're from Virginia and you're in New Jersey. And then extradition. You commit a crime, you flee to another state, that state arrests you, they have an obligation to extradite you back to the original state where the crime occurred. Now, we have a variety of different types of federalism, and these have evolved over time. For example, talking about dual federalism, this is really the way in which the national and the local governments operated in separate spheres. They had very little overlap. This ends in the 1930s thanks to the Great Depression, and you are going to begin to see the usher in of the cooperative type of federalism, where you're going to see the policies of these powers are being shared between the states and the national government. They are sharing joint responsibility. And this has sort of led to fiscal federalism, where they're providing grants to states with policies. We see this in the form of categorical grants, which says, here's money, but you have to spend it this way, or block grants. States love block grants because this supports broad programs and it gives them a lot of latitude. But the thing that states hate the most are something called unfunded mandates. And this is where they are told to do something and they're giving no financial support. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a great piece of legislation that says you have to make public accommodations for people who are handicapped. Sounds great. The problem is when you are building new buildings or retrofitting older buildings, it costs a lot of money to put elevators in and ramps, yet there's no funding from the federal government, and it still says you have to do it by law. Now, starting with Ronald Reagan, in terms of fiscal federalism, is going to usher in a period known as devolution, where you're going to transfer policies to the states from the federal government. And there's no guarantee of support. And we've seen states carry on more obligations and carry out more policies that were originally done by the federal government that are now being done at the state level, such as welfare. All right, let's get into Unit 2 here. And this is all about the differences between the Senate as well as the House. And certainly there are a lot of key differences listed here. I won't go through every single one, but important ones, right? Population, the House is determined versus the Senate. Two senators per state, whereas the House, every state gets at least one. Some have way more than others, such as California, as opposed to Montana. And keep in mind, too, that the Senate is known for giving more advice and consent, things like presidential nominations and ratifying treaties, where, of course, the major difference with the House is that all revenue bills, tax bills, have to initiate in the House of Representatives, including impeachment. Okay, so please make note of some of these as well. Now, where do we see the power of Congress? Well, that is found in Article 1, Section 8, and these are all of its powers from peacetime powers to even war powers. So these are what you call enumerated powers. They are listed, they are spelled out. These are delegated powers. So, for example, they have the right to establish and collect taxes, which they certainly do. They also have the right to declare war and to provide and maintain a navy. So these are some of the major overarching powers that Congress has. Now, although we just looked at our enumerated powers here, or our express powers, Congress also has implied powers. So we've seen a significant expansion of power, starting with the Alaska Clause with the previously mentioned McCulloch v. Maryland, which is going to create a national bank. Well, there's nothing in our Constitution that says national banks. However, the Alaska Clause exists there that says Congress can do whatever it deems necessary and proper. Well, that is a ton of power, depending on what you deem as necessary and proper. Also, you're going to see the regulation of commerce between states thanks to the Commerce Clause. And this is going to be used for a variety of things that don't even involve commerce. This is even going to be used to justify the Civil Rights Act, believe it or not. And we see that this is going to expand the power of the government significantly until we get to the Supreme Court case of U.S. v. Lopez, which is going to say, whoa, you saying that, Gun-Free School Zone Act has something to do with commerce? No way. So they're going to rule that to be unconstitutional. And that's the first time really that the government is checked on its power in the use of the Commerce Clause. So this has historically increased the power of Congress. However, it's not until the case of U.S. v. Lopez do we begin to see that change a little bit in favor of the states. All right, now when we look at congressional leadership, definitely important to know that the Speaker of the House is the person who runs the show. They are pretty much the face of Congress. They are the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives. They assign committees. They are important in terms of steering legislation. Versus the Senate, technically the VP is the head, but plays no role unless there's a tie. The real power rests in the majority leader, and they are very important in terms of determining the Senate agenda. Now, both sides are going to be assisted by whips. These are the go-betweens between the members as well as the leadership. So you tend to find more compromise in the Senate compared to the House. You tend to find much more party loyalty in the House as opposed to the Senate. Now, in terms of the committee system, that's really where the real work of Congress takes place. Some of the important standing committees that are permanent that you should really know: Rules and Ways and Means. Rules are the traffic cop of legislation. They can derail a bill very easily. The Ways and Means, all bills dealing with taxation and revenue have to initiate here. Versus the Senate, much more influential in foreign relations in terms of confirming appointments for ambassadors, ratifying treaties. You also see them very important in the Senate Judiciary Committee in terms of confirming nominees to the Supreme Court and the court system. Now, we also do have conference committees where when you have a bill being passed and you have to iron out the differences between both chambers of Congress, it will go into a conference committee. These are temporary as opposed to standing committees. And then you have a select committee that is also temporary that investigates a specific issue. Good example of that would be the Watergate Select Committee, which is temporary in terms of investigating. At this point, it was Richard Nixon. So various committees here, but definitely be aware of these special committees in the standing committees for each the House and the Senate. But while the committees do play a big role, and you might think that Congress is all about legislation, well, think again. It's also very important in terms of legislative oversight. They are going to try to hold the executive branch and the bureaucracy accountable. So we see this in terms of impeachment powers, confirmation of appointments, treaties, funding, defunding agencies. So these are non-legislative here. But in terms of budget, yeah, we see everything from appropriating money, authorizing a program. And there are certain aspects of the budget, such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, entitlement spending, that they have to allocate money to in the budget. The leftover money, which is known as discretionary spending, can be spent on other budgetary items that are not mandatory. So ultimately, taxation to increase revenue is needed as these entitlements grow. These are very, very fast growing and take up a good amount of the budget. Now, when you introduce a bill into the House or the Senate, this is the path that it's going to take. The only difference between the House and the Senate in terms of a bill, if it deals with taxation, it has to start in the House, as I've said before, in the Ways and Means Committee. But generally speaking, it will be introduced in the House or the Senate. It will go through all of this, going through the committees, and then it will go through leadership here in the Senate. And then it goes to a full vote of the Senate. You just need a majority to pass. If it goes through all these hurdles, it then gets reintroduced into the House. The committees mark it up, and then it goes to a full House. Remember that Rules Committee can derail legislation very easily. Once you get a passed bill in the House, just a simple majority, you have two different bills that have to be ironed out in the conference committee. Once that gets voted out of committee, it then goes to a full vote in the House as well as the Senate. Assuming it passes, then the president can take some type of decision as to sign it into law or simply veto it. All right, so influences onto Congress, everything from party polarization. Most votes by party for committee system, election support. Also, sometimes we see policy gridlock as a result of divided government. If you have two different parties in Congress, you're going to see more gridlock. Also, a lame duck president can be influential in leading Congress to refuse or to confirm appointments. We saw this under Barack Obama with his appointment of Justice Garland. And don't forget the role that lobbyists and interest groups also play. So we're going to stop right here, go on to part 2, and we'll continue with that.